Hi, this is the first of 3 lectures on the anthropological approach to language. Cultural anthropologists focus on language because language is fundamental to being a human. All humans use language in one way or another, yet different cultures use it differently, and different groups within cultures use it differently. Once again, we see the interplay between similarity and difference that is a central concern of anthropology. Language is a subset of communication. Specifically, its verbal or textual form. Anthropologists tend to focus on spoken language, though they also pay attention to other forms of communication, including written language, body art, styles of dress, and so on. There are 2 ways of thinking about language, as a system and as a practice. Anthropologists are interested in both, but tend to focus more on language as a practice than language as a system. One of the first to make this distinction between language as a system and language as a practice was the French linguist Fernand Saussure, who wrote in the late 19th and early 20th century. He used the terms parole, which meant words as actually spoken, and langue, which meant the formal rules of a language. Saussure argued for only studying the deep structure of language, which has had a big effect in linguistics, especially for those who are interested in understanding the universals of language. These people often are interested in how language operates through the physiology of the brain. Among them include the evolutionary psychologist Steven Pinker and the famous linguist and political commentator Noam Chomsky. Chomsky argued for studying linguistic competence, that is, the underlying grammatical rules encoded in the brains of all fluent speakers of a language, rather than linguistic performance, which pertains to how language is actually used. So, there are 3 elements of language as a system: phonology, grammar, and semantics. Phonology involves the categories for forming vocal symbols. Phonemes are speech sounds that make up spoken language. Different languages use different selections from the range of possible sounds that the human mouth and throat and tongue can make, and divide these sounds up differently. In learning phonology, the body is actually trained via culture. This is what happens when we learn to speak. And this is why speaking some foreign languages, like French or German, for native English speakers is so difficult. In those languages, the body is used differently. Grammar consists of the categories and rules for combining vocal symbols. No grammar covers all possible combinations of these symbols. This means that languages can and do change. There's always room for invention, even at the grammatical level, since there is always a gap between the world of experience and the world of language. Semantics consists of the rules for relating words to their reference, or what they refer to. One of the major insights of linguistics regarding semantics is that there is an arbitrary relationship between referent and symbol, meaning the word for tree in English and the actual object of a tree have no necessary relationship to each other. We could call a tree something completely different. We could call it a chair. And as long as we all agreed, we would be able to go on just fine. There are a few exceptions here, most famously what's called onomatopoeia, which is when a word sounds like what it depicts, a word like boom or bling or pow. The point here is, even if we just look at language as a system, we see there's always room for variation and change. This means how language is actually used is very important, because it's in this use that linguistic change happens. Anthropologists are interested in language as a system and language as a practice, and in particular, the relationships between the two. Unlike Chomsky, they are very much interested in linguistic performance, that is to say, how language is actually used in specific contexts. This is often called ethno or sociolinguistics. It's the study of language and its relationship to particular cultures and social situations. Here, the study of language becomes a way of understanding culture. The focus is not on language in and of itself as something separate from its context, but on how language and its context relates. In these lectures on language, we will look at 4 ways in which language and culture interact. We'll look at language and conceptions of the world and how this drives behavior. We'll look at language and identity. We'll look at language and technology. And lastly, we'll look at language and power and inequality. An early example of this, as discussed by Guy Ducher in the article I had you read for this module, was the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which argues that cultural categories are to a great extent determined by linguistic categories. It basically argues that people can think about and therefore act upon only things that they can express or describe linguistically. The example that Benjamin Whorf and Edward Sapir, the 2 linguistic anthropologists who arrived at this thesis, they were active in the early part of the 20th century, used was that of the linguistic structure of the Hopi Indians. The argument here was that Hopi language had different tense structures than English and other Western languages, and that this difference led to time working very differently in Hopi language and therefore in Hopi culture. For instance, Sapir and Whorf argued that Hopi tenses were based not on a timeline, as in our tense structure, which generally distinguishes actions occurring in the past, present, and future, but rather Hopi tenses were based on the source of knowledge about an action. In the 2 highlighted examples we see on this slide, different tenses are distinguished by whether or not the speaker is stating a fact based on memory or based on another source of knowledge. Sapir and Whorf argued that as a result of how this tense structure worked in Hopi language, Hopi people did not have words for time as a substance, that is, something that could be used or spent. They also argued that since Hopi language did not depend on a timeline, that it did not have the kind of spatial metaphors for time that our language does. For example, they argued that the Hopi could not speak of moving through time in the way that we can. So the upshot of all this was that having or spending time was not something that really made sense for the Hopi, given their language. The Hopi saw time as something that was to be reckoned in relationship to cycles and tasks that are in process, rather than in relation to an abstract timeline. Sapir and Whorf argued that this led to practices very different from ours. For instance, they argued that the Hopi didn't really use deadlines the way we do. They argued that the structure of a language, how language works as a system, determined how it could be used in practice and translated into people's behavior. This is called linguistic determinism. As Deutscher notes, though it brings up some interesting issues, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that language determines culture has come under a lot of criticism. People have argued that it ignores the flexibility of language and overstates the correlation between language, thought, and behavior. For instance, we might notice that language can be used in all sorts of creative ways that don't necessarily correspond directly to behavior. Writers, like fiction writers, use tense in creative ways all the time. We have probably all read a short story or novel written in the present tense that actually describes things in the past. So the relationships between tense usage, for instance, and time reckoning is not always straightforward. In addition, the empirical research that Sapir and Whorf did has come under scrutiny, and many of the claims they made, for instance, about the Hopi and their inability to meet deadlines, have been challenged. In fact, it is clear that Hopi people can meet deadlines and reckon time in ways similar to Euro-American culture. One famous example of this is the Hopi High School track team in Northeast Arizona. The team won 27 cross-country titles between 1980 and 2016, and it's hard to imagine doing this if you aren't able to think about time in measurable quantities, as Sapir and Whorf claimed the Hopi could not. It is interesting to note that culture did play a role in this team's success. For Hopi, running is understood as a form of prayer, which might help explain the commitment necessary to achieve this kind of success. In general, it is argued that Sapir and Whorf erred in assuming that the kind of very real linguistic differences that existed between Hopi and European-based languages like English would result in drastic cultural differences. While there are, of course, differences between the Hopi and Euro-American cultures, there are also many similarities. All this shows that the idea of linguistic determinism is not correct. Language does not drive culture in a simple or straightforward way. So, very few, if any, anthropologists believe now that language is determinative of culture. But many anthropologists do believe that language plays a role in how we classify and categorize the world, and this in turn does impact our behavior. As Deutscher argues, language does influence habits of thought that shape behavior and experience. Language may oblige us to focus on certain information, like gender. As he notes, languages with gender constructions require us to gender objects, which might affect how we think about them and act in regards to them. Another example here involves the use of egocentric or relative terms like there, here, behind, in front, and so on, versus cardinal terms like east and west to describe space. Deutscher describes an Australian Aboriginal language that uses only cardinal terms like east and west and does not have egocentric or relative terms like in front or behind. As a result, people who use this language must know how they are oriented to the east, to the west, to the south, and to the north at all times. They learn to do this automatically, and they retain information related to this in memory. Compare these folks to us. I'll bet you can only figure out how you are oriented to the cardinal directions by using some kind of landmark, an east-west road in front of your house, for instance. Few of us have the ability to instantly indicate which direction is which. We just don't need to know that. But we do know what's in front of us and what's behind us and what's to our left and what's to our right. So, language clearly influences culture, but in complex ways. Let's explore this some more. Another later example of the sociocultural role of language is anthropologist Del Heim's reaction against Noam Chomsky, who we talked about a couple of slides ago. Himes stressed the notion of communicative competence. He argued that knowledge of language requires far more than knowing what is grammatical or ungrammatical. Rather, we choose vocabulary and forms of speech that are suitable or appropriate to different social and cultural situations. This led Himes to study speech communities, which he defined as concrete communities of persons who regularly interact using language. Here, the Spradley article is relevant. The bar he describes constitutes a speech community, as of the group we might call legitimate bar customers. The members of these groups use language in a particular way, as Spradley describes. Moreover, different ways of asking for a drink in different situations signals that you are a member of a certain group. For instance, if I went into a college kid bar and said, "Hey dude, give me a brewski," you would probably think I, as an older person and a professor, was a bit of a weirdo. But if a 20-year-old man said this, no problem, except that he's underage. Likewise, if you ask for a drink that way in a fancy bar in a hipster neighborhood in Brooklyn, you might get dirty looks from the bartenders and clientele. The point here is that people use language to make a claim that they are part of some group, whether it be cool kids, people over 21, the educated, the well-bred, and so on. We use language to help establish different aspects of our identity, that is, who we are. Importantly, because our identities are complex, the speech communities we are part of are too. They come in many different forms and are constituted on different bases. Hopefully, you got a sense of this from the exercise I asked you to do for the discussion board. You yourselves are all members of many different speech communities, and you switch between them smoothly all the time. Moreover, you probably have experienced what happens when you use language in a way that is inappropriate for a particular speech community. There is usually some kind of correction, whether it's a funny look or something more explicit and direct. In what follows, we'll look at two bases on which speech communities are based: dialects and registers. We will spend more time talking about dialects, but we will touch on registers at the end of the lecture. First, we'll look at dialects. The important thing to note here is there is no single normal form of the language. Every speaker of the language speaks a certain dialect of that language, or a version of that language. By definition, a dialect is a full and complete version of the language, governed by rules of grammar and having a certain vocabulary. What those rules and lexicons might be vary from dialect to dialect, though. To get at this, let's talk about the Okrent article, which describes three common dialects of American English: Appalachian English, African American English, and Southern English. Each of these departs from the dialect that is typically considered normal, that is, Standard American English, which is actually itself a series of dialects. So, we have Appalachian English. "I'm a hunting," an Appalachian English speaker might say. This might sound incorrect to us, but in fact, in Appalachian English, it is correct. It follows rules. As the article describes, that a prefix, "I'm a hunting," is only attached to verbs, not gerunds, adjectives, objects, or prepositions. So to say that correctly, you'd say, "I was a huntin'," but you wouldn't say, "those a screamin' kids," or "I like a huntin'," or "he makes money by a huntin'." Those forms are wrong. As Okrent says, someone who doesn't follow those rules, for example, in a ham-fisted attempt to mock the dialect, can be said to speaking ungrammatical Appalachian English. There's another example in the Okrent article from African American English. The stressed "been" as an indicator of time depth. So you might say, "she been married," or "I been ate it," which meant you did it a long time ago, or you've been doing it a long time. But you wouldn't say, "been Lisa and John dating?" That's incorrect. There's also the Southern English "like to," which means started to do something. "I like to work on my homework." There's also, of course, y'all. That's a very useful term that doesn't exist in Standard American English. This brings up an important point. Some of these forms in dialects that are often considered incorrect are actually very useful. Standard American English doesn't have them, and they add flexibility to the language. It's also important to note that some forms of English that are considered classier or proper, like British English, also has departures from Standard American English. For example, in British English, you might say, "I'm going to do that at the weekend." Or you might say, "Will you go shopping this weekend?" "Yes, I might do." Those are things that don't quite make sense in Standard American English, but they are part of British English. Again, these are separate dialects that they have different ways of doing things that are correct in the context of the dialect, even if from the perspective of another dialect of English, they sound wrong. From a linguistic perspective, none of these dialects are better or worse than each other. They're all valid forms of English. But if we think about social and cultural attitudes, we should note that these three dialects, Appalachian English, African American English, and Southern English, are often seen as not proper English when compared against Standard American English or British English. This has to do with who gets to determine what's normal and who doesn't, and who's speaking, rather than any neutral linguistic criteria. So typically, in the United States and other places, it's highly educated white and middle and upper class people who determine what's considered normal. Which dialects are considered normal or proper has to do with power and inequality and status. This is very important to remember as we move forward. There are dozens and dozens of dialects of American English, as this map indicates. While some are defined by racial or ethnic groupings, many are defined geographically. Indeed, in our region, there are a bunch of dialects. For instance, if we drive an hour and a half south of Montclair State University, we'll encounter a particularly notable dialect, one that you may have encountered before. The following video, made by a college and then graduate student of linguistics in Philadelphia, discusses this mid-Atlantic dialect. One of its key features is the pronunciation of the 3 words at the bottom of the slide. Before moving on to the video, pause and say those 3 words. Take note of how you pronounce them. Do you say them the same way, or do you distinguish between them? Once you do that, go on to the video.
Go up to somebody on the streets of Philadelphia, Wilmington, or Baltimore and ask them, what makes our accent so special? They'll probably say something like, well, we say things like G, yeah, nah, Jew, and use guys. Well, those are definitely things we say, but they ain't what make our accent special. People all over the northern cities, from New York to Minneapolis, say G, yeah, and use guys. So what I want to do in this video is give a very brief overview of what makes Mid-Atlantic English so unique amongst all the North American English dialects. The main points to take away are, we ain't quite Southern, we ain't quite Northern, but we're 100% beautiful. To start off, I want to chart the Mid-Atlantic Sprachraum for you. It includes Philadelphia and Camden and their suburbs, Reading, Atlantic City and most of South Jersey, Wilmington and northern Delaware, Baltimore and its suburbs, and Trenton and parts of central Jersey, although they have some New York City influences. If you ask somebody in Philadelphia if they talk like people in Baltimore, chances are they'll say, no way, they don't talk like me at all. And if you ask people in Baltimore, same thing about people in Philly, they'll probably respond, no way, they don't talk like me at all, hon. They are 2 separate accents within the same dialect, but the differences are small. A majority of the descriptions of Mid-Atlantic English I'm about to get into apply to pretty much the whole region. One of the most noticeable differences other Northerners point out about Mid-Atlantic speakers is our long O's. Whereas a New Yorker would say, I gotta go home. We'd say, I gotta go home. This feature groups us in what linguists call the Southeast Superregion, along with Southern dialects and Midland dialects, and separates us from Northern and Western dialects. Although it sounds to me like we take the O to more of an extreme than any Southern or Midlander or Pittsburgher. Oh no, I broke my phone. My phone's broken. We do that with the long O before most consonants, but not before L or R. Listen to the difference between mode and mope and mole and more. Same goes for the long U. Spoon and shoot and school and shore. Another important feature of Mid-Atlantic English is our strong resistance to what linguists call the caught-cot merger. For most people with this merger, caught is pronounced exactly the same as caught. So they'd say, I caught a ball in a caught. In Pittsburgh, they'd say, I caught a ball in a caught. But here we'd say, I caught a ball on a cot. A Pittsburgher would say, Don Corleone. And a Californian would say, the break of dawn. The caught-cot merger is spreading like wildfire throughout much of the country, but certain dialects are resisting, using different strategies. The Great Lakes cities are saying, I caught the ball on the cat. The South is saying, I caught the ball on the cot. New York City and the Mid-Atlantic are saying, I caught the ball on the cot. The aw sound is getting more extreme, more and more different from ah. For us, night'll never be followed by dawn. So New York and the Mid-Atlantic both resist the merger by going crazy with the aw sound, but that's one of the few similarities between the two. They're still a northern accent, and we're still a Midland accent, which is demonstrated by these 2 words. In New York, they're both ah, and in Philly and Baltimore, they're both aw. So a New Yorker would say, yo, yous want the light on or off? And we'd say, yeah, yous want the light on or off? There ain't that much that the big 3 northeastern dialects have in common, but one of them is what we do a short O before intervocalic R. You're thinking, what the hell does that mean? Well, let me give you an example. Most of the country says, oranges from Florida have historically been horrible, except us, and probably Florida. It's like the orange sore, but for us it's like the orange sorry. So we'd say, the oranges in Florida have historically been horrible. A florist is somebody who sells flowers. A florist would be somebody who sells floors. Another one of the few similarities between us, New York, and New England is our resistance to the Mary merger. The vast majority of the US and Canada pronounce all 3 of those words the same, like Mary had a Merry Christmas because she got married. All right, listen closely out of Tanners because I'm only going to say this once. Mary had a Merry Christmas because she got married. Mary, just like it's spelled. Baltimore merges Mary with Mary, so they'll like have a Merry Christmas. But in Philly, they're actually not merging, they're getting more different. Mary is turning into Murray, like Bill Murray. In Baltimore, they'd say, take the ferry across the river. But in Philadelphia, a lot of us would say, take the ferry across the river. The best telltale sign that somebody's from the Mid-Atlantic is what linguists call our split short A system. Short A's can either be pronounced a or eh. A lot of people in the country use a before most consonants, like Jack's a badass, but use eh before M and N, like let's jam, man. And this is why in a lot of northern cities, an introduction like this is pretty damn confusing. Ian, meet Ann. Ann, Ian. But here in the Mid-Atlantic, we have a much more complicated system of what short A's are at and what short A's are eh. New York City has a closely related but different system. The basic rule for ours is a becomes eh if it's followed by m or n, but also f, s, or th, as in lamb, man, bath, pass, and laugh. Every other consonant gets a, as in lad, lack, latch, lad, lag, badge, pal, bang, lep, lash, bat, hat, and jazz. The exceptions are the words am, and, ran, swam, began, and the past tense of win, wan. Like, yo, Mike, were you watching when the Eagles won last night? Dr. Seuss's I am Sam, Sam I am. Well, that don't rhyme for us. Also, this word is pronounced Ken, but the opposite is pronounced can, and a noun is pronounced can, so we're like, yo, can I get a can of soda? Although we normally shorten it to Kai, as in like, yo, Kai have a can of soda? Also, the words bad, glad, and mad are exceptions. They don't rhyme with ad, had, and sad. So a good test to see if someone's from the Mid-Atlantic would be to ask them to read this sentence. Is Dad mad, sad, or glad? Only around Philly and Baltimore do those words not rhyme. Also, math don't rhyme with bath and path for some reason. Also, as, has, and jazz, they all end in a Z sound. They don't rhyme with gas, which is what you fuel your car up with. Oh, looks like I need to stop and get gas. But that's just a weird vocab word. But anyway, these short A's are complicated as hell, right? Well, it gets even more confusing. If a short A is on the first syllable of a word with more than one syllable, it's always at, unless it comes directly from a one-syllable word that's air. Like panning comes directly from pan, so it's air. But panel is its own word, so it stays at, panel. Alright, we're getting a nice panning shot of the Panama Canal. So we get a whole bunch of non-rhyming pairs like span and Spanish, man and manage, ass and aspirin, calf and cafeteria, mass and Massachusetts, laugh and Lafferty, and Ann and Anna. And there are a few exceptions like after and handle. I've always said planets, which is different from plan, but most young kids anymore they're saying planets. Don't sound right to me, but the accent's evolving fast. Like I said, our split short A system is complicated as hell, but we all get it right every day without even thinking about it. Now, this is something that every Philadelphia and Baltimorean should be proud of. Our language is such a complicated system of short A's that nobody who didn't grow up around here can ever learn to properly imitate us. How the hell will they ever figure out how to say, have the hoagie, then have half?
There are a lot of interesting things in that video, but I want you to note what the narrator said toward the end about the complex way in which Mid-Atlantic English deals with the short A sound. He said, "It's complicated, but we get it right every time." I want to emphasize this because it shows the power of culture to shape how our bodies function, in this case, how they function to produce spoken language. We learn all the complicated ins and outs of different dialects, usually without even knowing it or thinking about it too much. It's part of the acculturation process. Our bodies are trained to say words in certain ways, and our brains are trained to follow the complex rules of pronunciation and so on without even really thinking about it. Even more impressive, we do this in a context in which linguistic change is always happening. Dialects are constantly changing, but we keep up with these changes without even noticing them. This shows the power of culture to shape our behavior in ways that we don't even notice. Dialects have specific vocabularies or lexicons. There are words that are common in certain regions and not in others. For instance, as the map on the top of this slide shows, people refer to soft drinks in all sorts of ways in different places. In the Midwest and West, they say pop. In the Northeast, we typically say soda. And in the South, they say Coke. In some places, a rubber band is called a gum band. Immigration can affect this too, as foreign words become assimilated into English. A great example is the effect of Yiddish in New York City. Words like schlep, schmear, and so on are widespread there. Indeed, there are all sorts of regionally specific terms, including slang terms like a Mac machine, which is what people from the Philly area call an ATM machine, or the word jawn, which is a word for thing or that thing that is actually spreading to our region. I hear teenagers saying this word now. Before, I'd really only heard it in Pennsylvania. The map on the bottom of the slide shows some slang terms that are popular in certain states, like the word sketchy, which is used a lot in our area. Of course, probably the best known example of this in New Jersey is this one. Whether or not you call this kind of sandwich a pork roll versus a Taylor ham sandwich is a pretty clear dividing line of North versus South in our state. But this geographic distinction also reflects political and cultural divides in the state. The northern part of New Jersey is more oriented towards New York City, while the southern part is less so. So there's a lot more happening here than just how you order a breakfast sandwich. Accents are also important here. Indeed, we often use accents to ascribe characteristics to people. To get at this, I'm going to play 3 accents. As I do, note what you think these people might look like. Okay, here we go.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring those things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob. We also need a small plastic snake and a big toy frog for the kids. She can scoop these things into 3 red bags, and we will go meet her Wednesday at the train station.
So what does someone who speaks like that look like? Maybe someone like this? This is Fran Drescher, an actress who played a nanny from Long Island in a long-running sitcom. Okay, here comes a second accent.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring these things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob. We also need a small plastic snake and a big toy frog for the kids. She can scoop these things into 3 red bags, and we will go to meet her Wednesday at the train station.
So what do you think that person looks like? Maybe someone like this gentleman from Arkansas with overalls, a hat, someone who looks like a farmer? Let's hear our third accent.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring these things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob. We also need a small plastic snake and a big toy frog for the kids. She can scoop these things into 3 red bags, and we will go meet her Wednesday at the train station.
Maybe that third accent calls to mind someone like Paula Deen, the popular TV hostess of cooking shows, at least until she made some racist comments that got her kicked off the air. The point here is that we often ascribe meanings to accents, and these are culturally determined. They often reflect stereotypes. People often think of Brooklyn accents as trashy, or as people with Brooklyn accents as kind of brash and confrontational. They might think of Appalachian or Southern accents as signs of stupidity or backwardness. More positively, Southern accents can be seen as expressing down-to-earthness or hospitality. This is especially true if we're talking about a woman's accent. So accents can have positive and negative connotations, depending on the identity of the speaker, their gender, for instance, and who it is that's evaluating that accent. Ultimately, the point is that how we talk and who we are, our speech and our identities are linked. We might have an identity ascribed to us by others, rightly or wrongly, based on how we speak. So accents affect how we perceive others, but they also impact how we understand ourselves. One might embrace an identity by speaking a certain way. This video trailer, which I'm going to play next, from a film called If These Knishes Could Talk, gets at this by looking at the classic New York City accent. As you watch this clip, think about all of the different aspects of life in New York City that are implicated in that accent, beyond just linguistic issues.
If you don't like the way I talk, fuck you.
When I was a kid, we lived in California for about 4 years. And every place I ever went, they'd hear me say 2 words in New York.
There are sounds that we all recognize that are part of the New York accent.
Words like shine or oy vey.
Hey, what are you talking about?
Tutty, tutty, tutty.
Come to his house
I'm getting my kizar.
Say it how you were saying it.
How I used to say it?
Mm-hmm.
Saucy sausage.
Right, and look how what the lips are doing and your jaw's a little bit more closed, right? And now go to the more neutral.
Saucy sausage.
Better.
I talk like this, I talk like that.
You want coffee?
I'll get you and your little dog too.
It becomes part of your personality.
They're not usually on the quiet side.
Everyone in my family was loud. I mean, they were just loud people. Barbara, come up already. It's time to eat dinner.
I think my voice kind of belies what I look like. An Asian Guido from Staten Island, the Stasian.
There's a real openness. There's a real willingness to put it out there that I think is reflected in the sound.
Crack you right in that doesn't mean anything.
Right.
It's like,
It's hard for me to understand people that aren't from New York.
Dawn, are you working offline?
Yeah. Hey, Dawn.
Hey, Dawn.
See you at dawn.
See you at dawn.
Historically, New York was really the place, like with the Statue of Liberty, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses.
well, the original accent that was really, an amalgam of all those immigrants who came over, their voices. The Yiddish, the Italian, the German, the Irish.
Over time, it disappeared.
The New York I grew up in was nothing like the New York that exists now.
My grandmother moved on this block when she come from Italy, never left, 3-room apartment.
You can't even smoke in New York now.
The dominant emotion in New York is nostalgia.
I feel like a nostalgia for ghosts, essentially.
It was scrappy, poor folks who'd arrive with $10 in their pocket and then make it.
The velocity of change, which is just natural to a city like this. You go away for the summer, you come back and your favorite coffee shop is a hole in the ground.
Where were the working class Irish, working class Italian, working class blacks, Puerto Ricans? Where did they go?
They can't afford to live here. There's something magical about a city like New York is going to vanish.
No more accents. It's all acting. Hey, Kate, how you doing?
We're so affected by what we hear on the radio and television.
Suttin, Sutton. That's something that we see almost exclusively in New York. Regional differences in language are alive and well in social media.
Language keeps changing from the bottom. It's the slang that becomes sanctified.
New York is always going to be in flux.
War between the nostalgia and willed amnesia.
Accents have a reason for existing. They support your existence in one way or another.
What do you sound like?
Note that in this video, all sorts of things, New York City's immigrant history, its racial and ethnic diversity, its gentrification and upscaling, link to language usage, and the presence or absence of a New York City accent. Moreover, note the fascinating fact that the New York City way of talking impacts other forms of communication besides speech, American Sign Language and social media usage, for instance. Thus, communication broadly, not just the spoken word, is a vehicle for the construction and reconstruction of what kind of city New York is and what it means to be a New Yorker. As well as regional dialects, forms of a language that differ over space, there are also what are called social dialects, which are dialects spoken by people in the same place that indicate social differences, like that of class, race, ethnicity, and so on. In the next minute or two, I'll give you an example of a major difference in social dialect that one sees among people living very close to each other in one city. What I'm going to do is play 2 audio clips of accents. See if you can identify which one is more upper class and which one is more working class.
The law is very formal and strict in that regard.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring these things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob.
The first of these two is an example of what's commonly known as a Boston Brahmin accent, which is typically used by wealthy elites in New England. You'll notice that it sounds kind of British, but it is common among the kind of person whose family has been in the United States since the Mayflower came over. Members of white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant elite families with long roots in Boston and thereabouts, elites who often intermarry and socialize with each other. The second accent is a classic South Boston working class accent. It reflects that part of the city's history as a working class neighborhood, as well as a neighborhood where Irish and then Italian immigrants landed. The accent reflects that class history as well as ethnic and religious differences. South Boston is much more Catholic than the more elite areas of Boston, which are Protestant. So you can literally walk in less than 20 minutes from a neighborhood where the first accent is what you will hear on the streets to one where the second accent is more common. This accent accentuates, no pun intended, social distance, that of class differences rather than geographic distances. It emphasizes class identity rather than regional identity. Okay, that in-depth discussion should give you a good sense of how the dialect we use, the particular form of English, is related to multiple aspects of our identities. There are also other examples of how this relationship works, most notably what are called social registers. A social register is a more limited linguistic pattern, one used only in a certain setting. This is more or less what we call jargon and/or slang. I expect that some of you gave examples of social registers in the exercise about speech communities. Certain speech communities are constituted by the use of a particular social register. Restaurant workers or emergency room doctors are prominent examples. They use social registers in order to get things done quickly and efficiently. So do athletes, or academics, or retail workers. Moreover, we typically use different linguistic registers when we use communications technology, like texting or social media, but we will discuss that more next week. What's important to note about registers is that they have a clear function, allowing communication to be efficient and fast, but they also serve as a marker of identity. One of the ways in which you show you were a real soccer player or a real skater or a real emergency room doctor is by using the appropriate social register in the correct way. Okay, let's wrap up. In all the ways I've described in this lecture, language becomes associated with our identity. All the different aspects of our identities make us members of different speech communities, and membership in these speech communities builds up our identities. Because we have many different aspects to our identities, we all have what are called verbal repertoires. Each of us has mastered, or is working to master, a series of dialects, registers, and so on that allows us to function in different contexts and lay claim to authentic membership in different groups. The broader our verbal repertoires, the better we are able to cope with different social situations. The ability to move between speech communities and thus social and cultural situations by speaking differently is called code switching, and it's an important cultural skill. So, speech is about communicating information, but it is also about establishing identity. All this complex activity is usually going on at the edge of our consciousness or at the level of the unconscious. Indeed, language use is one of the most amazing things about culture and acculturation. We do incredibly complex and creative things with language all the time, usually without thinking about it at all. Okay, that's it for our first lecture. Thanks for your attention, and see you next time.